Hello, and welcome to this Museum at Home webinar on the Korean War. I'm Amanda Dennett, Head of Digital Experience at the Australian War Memorial. 70 years on, we're reflecting on Australia's involvement in the Korean War, and we'll take a close-up look at some of the items from the Memorial's collection. Our presenters today are Michael Kelly, a First World War and Korean War historian in the Military History section at the Memorial. Michael is co-editor of In From the Cold, Reflections on Australia's Korean War, published by ANU Press. Elise Horspool completed her Bachelor of Arts, History major and minor at the Australian National University. She's worked in many roles at the Memorial, most recently as Assistant Curator in the Military Heraldry and Technology section. This is an interactive webinar. Please send your questions by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom window. We'll answer some of them at the end of the presentation. Once again, welcome, and I'll now hand over to our presenters.
Thank you, Amanda. My name is Michael Kelly. I'm one of the historians here at the Australian War Memorial, and I've had a deep and abiding interest in the Korean War ever since I was a little boy, but predominantly since I joined the Army. I was posted to the 89th Infantry Battalion, where I became a rifleman. And on joining the battalion, my section commanders basically told me and my comrades that we'd learn about our regimental history and there'd be a test. And I got really very much interested in the Korean War through that, because the Royal Australian Regiment fought its first war in Korea. So that took me basically down a wormhole, which has been my life's passion. I'm also at the Australian War Memorial a current editor, along with Professor John Blaxland and Liam Bruin-Higgins, on the publication In From the Cold. This is a book which stems from the 2011 Australian War Memorial Conference, which was a great meeting of the minds of veterans and academics at the time, and their thoughts and ideas have been translated into that book. It's a great primer for anybody who's got a passing interest in Korea and just wants to know a bit more about why, which I'll cover a little bit more in the presentation as well. But it's a great way to start with an interest in the Korean War. I'll start with looking at how the Korean Peninsula was divided up in 1945. So you can see on the slide here that Korea divided. At the end of the Second World War, Korea was divided into two, with the Russians, or the Soviets, basically declaring war on Japan between the first atomic bomb and the second atomic bomb being dropped in Japan, and they invaded the Korean Peninsula. The Americans, who were on their way into Japan at this point in time as well, after having bombed it, basically, well, in between the bombs, basically put a force into Korea as well, with a division at the 38th parallel to keep the Soviets from having a very close proximity to the Japan as well, which America intended to occupy at the end of the war. So you can see on the map there the division at the 38th parallel, with the northern zone at obviously the top, and the southern zone at the bottom, and these would become the nations later, which I'll cover as we get on. So at the end of the Second World War, Korea is politically weakened due to the Japanese occupation, which had begun in 1910 and had concluded at the end of the Second World War in September of 1945. So the Japanese had done a particularly good job at taking out the nationalist leadership in Korea, which left them weak and unable to form a government, or one overarching government behind a national figure that was acceptable to everyone. As I was talking about before, the country was divided at the 38th parallel into the northern and southern zones, and because the north was occupied by the Russians, the northern zone became a communist satellite state, and the south became a capitalist state or a autocratic state under the auspices of the United States as well. So, and you can see the future leaders there on the bottom of the slide as well. So we've got Syngman Rhee on the left, who becomes the first president of the Republic of Korea, and Kim Il-sung, who becomes the first premier of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea as well. In late 1947, the United Nations, which is well and truly in Korea by this stage, passes a resolution that dictates, or doesn't dictate, but it basically suggests that free and fair elections should be held the following year to reunite the country. The Soviets immediately boycott this because they believe, and with some justification, that this is not going to be free and fair. So they boycott that immediately and don't take part. So in May 1948, the elections take place only in the south, against the advice of and the wishes of the people as well. of Korea. But they do go ahead, and Syngman Rhee is elected the first president of the Republic of Korea, which comes into existence on the 15th of August 1948, the same year. The Democratic People's Republic of Korea, which replaces the Northern Zone, comes into existence basically the following month on the 9th of September 1948. Australia's military position in 1945 was one of war weariness, so Australian forces were being brought home from their various fronts and places of deployment and demobilising. So we were in a position of drawing down our forces and discharging men and women who'd served in the Army, Navy and the Air Force. The thing that the Australians did do as part of the ending of the war was send a force to Japan as part of the British Commonwealth occupation forces. So at the end of the war, we have a brigade of infantry, a wing of aircraft, so it's 3 squadrons of fighters plus some transport planes, and also the several vessels, ships of the Royal Australian Navy. And this remains in force throughout, right up until the end of the Korean War, or right up to the Korean War, sorry. But by 1950, a lot of the forces have actually left Japan, and we're in the transitional period of actually withdrawing from Japan and returning to Australia. So by June 1950, just as the war was about to kick off, 3 RAR, which is about 550 men at this stage, is in the process of winding up and getting ready to come back to Australia. Number 77 Squadron, which is the only squadron left in Japan, has already packed up its aircraft and is in the process of a 3-day party saying goodbye to friends, colleagues and comrades in Japan as they prepare to return to Australia. And the frigate HMAS Shoalhaven is about to be replaced by HMAS Bataan, a destroyer which is on its way up to Japan as war is declared. Just prior to the Korean War beginning, 2 Australians actually undertook a reconnaissance of the 38th parallel. Major Stuart Peach, who had been a prisoner of the Japanese during the Second World War, had actually been stationed in Japan with the occupation forces. And Squadron Leader Ronald Rankin, who was a highly decorated fighter pilot, had actually been sent up from Australia. He was actually in the process of doing search and rescue flights in Australia when he was tasked with going up to help with this reconnaissance. So from the 9th of June to the 23rd of June, these 2 men travelled along the 38th parallel and basically observed the situation on both sides of the border, although they weren't allowed to observe north, so they could only hear noises of build-ups and movements behind the border. But they mainly talked to the Republic of Korean troops and their US advisors, and just gauged their readiness overall for any potential warfighting. And they found overall that the Republic of Korean Army forces were basically set up for defence only, and that they were in no way able to conduct any offensive operations into North Korea had they been so ordered by their president. This the Peach and Rankin report, which they submitted, which became known as, was submitted on the evening of the 24th of June, and the last line of that report basically said that they foresaw no invasion from the north at all at any stage. But less than 12 hours later, they would have been fairly chagrined to sort of see a northern invasion coming across the 38th parallel, and they themselves being forced to flee through the Busan perimeter and back to Japan. But their report, which was tabled to the United Nations Security Council the following day, was actually able to help the passage of UN resolutions 82 and 83, which basically gave the United Nations the go-ahead to send a United States-led force in to support the Republic of Korea and maintain the Republic of Korea's sovereignty. So the UN was greatly assisted by the Peach and Rankin report. And when you're looking at the slide here, you can actually see in the top left of the right image, or the central left, sorry, the right image, the empty chair which would have been occupied by the Soviet delegation, or the delegate Jacob Malik. He had been boycotting the United Nations Security Council since January of 1950 over the failure of the United Nations Security Council to recognise the Communist Chinese with the seat on the council, which was still held by the nationalist Chinese following their defeat by the Communists in the Chinese Civil War in 1949. So Russia was boycotting the Security Council to try and get the Communist Chinese their seat, which they believe should be theirs. So the lack of a Soviet veto also helped the United Nations pass those resolutions successfully. And Stalin recognised the mistake that they'd made very quickly after that, and Malik was soon back at the table using his power of veto for future decisions. So, but at the start of the Korean War, a lot of great factors went in favour of the UN and being able to assist the Republic of Korea. Australian forces, as I was saying before, were already in Japan, but many of them weren't in a great situation to be deployed immediately. The Navy was, thankfully, so the Australian government immediately placed the HMAS Shoalhaven and the HMAS Bataan at under MacArthur's command, because there wasn't a US Navy command in place at that stage. So MacArthur had the initial command, and Bataan and Shoalhaven were very quickly put into the roles of escorting and patrol duties to try and keep the North Korean sea forces down and in their ports or destroy them. But a lot of escorting in the main was done by the Navy. And they were committed on the 29th of June. The following day, MacArthur basically demanded the use of 77 Squadron, and this was also granted to him by the Australian government. He knew the 77 Squadron had a fantastic reputation in Japan as an air-to-ground combat unit or gunnery unit. So they had the squadron actually boasted the best ground attack gunner in the entire Far East Air Forces at that stage. And MacArthur had that in his mind when he asked for that squadron. And even though they'd already packed up their aircraft, their ground crew had done a magnificent job in the space of a couple of days, basically, to get their aircraft unboxed and combat ready. And they flew their first combat operation, which was the first combat operation of the United Nations, over from Japan to Korea on the 2nd of July. So it's no mean feat to actually get a squadron combat ready from pack down within a week. And as you can see on the slide here as well, it wasn't just 77 Squadron that was committed. We also had a flight of Dakota aircraft as well, doing transport and communication roles, as well as medical evacuations, plus maintenance and administration squadrons as well. The significant thing about 77 Squadron's deployment to Korea as well is they initially started off in propeller-driven Mustang aircraft, World War II veteran aircraft, and they transitioned from those to Meteor fighters jet fighters in April 1951, when they were briefly withdrawn from the Korean Peninsula to transfer over to these jet aircraft. The squadron was initially put back into Korea as air-to-air combat squadron, and they came up against the Chinese and Russian flown MiGs, and they had the worst of it. And they were then transferred back to their ground attack role, which was where their strength really truly lied. So the squadron still suffered a number of casualties, and this is largely due to the ventral tank underneath the Meteor being able to be hit by ground fire, and the aircraft would catch fire. So we still lost pilots, but the Australian ground attack squadron, as a ground attack squadron, 77 Squadron certainly had a high reputation during the Korean War. The Australian Army was in a much worse shape than the Navy and the Air Force as a way of being deployed immediately. So they weren't actually committed until late July 1950 by the Australian government. The government realised that they didn't have enough men in Japan to actually deploy the 3RAR, which was the only battalion still in Japan. So they put a call out for volunteers, and this was under the banner of K-Force. So basically called for volunteers to do a 2-year stint in the Army, which included a 1-year deployment to Korea as well on a war footing. So when the doors opened about 7 years ago now this week, the K-Force volunteers were soon filled by Second World War veterans who hadn't quite had enough, young men who also had missed out on the Second World War as well. And the ranks were very quickly filled, not only of 3RAR, but they were able to reconstitute the 1st and 2nd battalions as well, which were battalions on paper only by this stage as well. So the 3rd Battalion was brought up to strength throughout August, and they had a new commanding officer sent to them as well, who was Lieutenant Colonel Charlie Green, who was the youngest battalion commander in the Second World War at the age of 25. And when he took over 3RAR in August 1950, he was only 30 years old, but had significant combat experience, so was the right man to take the battalion to war. The battalion arrived in Korea on the 29th of September and joined the British 27th Commonwealth Brigade, and they fought with that formation up until the Battle of Kapyong, after which they transferred to the 28th Commonwealth Brigade and remained with that formation for the rest of the war. The 1st and 2nd Battalions, as you can see on the slide, deployed to Korea. The 1st Battalion deployed first and joined 3RAR in the 28th Brigade in March 1952 to March 1953. And they took part in a number of significant raids during that period of time. And the first and only time we carried flamethrowers in combat as well, during one of the daylight raids on one of the Chinese positions as well. So it's one RAR has some pretty interesting service. And they're replaced by two RAR in March 1953. And two RAR actually fight the last battle of the Korean War at the Samachon, and over the last 3 days of the Korean War, and actually see some pretty significant and heavy action in those last 3 days as well. And they return home in 1954 and are replaced again by one RAR. The Australians had a number of men taken prisoners, so 30 Australians were taken prisoner throughout the course of the war, 7 from the Air Force, the Royal Australian Air Force, and 23 from the Army. Of those, the most significant one of the prisoners was Private Horry Slim Madden, who was posthumously awarded the George Cross. Slim Madden was captured at Kapyong. He's a Second World War veteran like many others as well. And he, between his capture at Kapyong and his death in November of 1951, becomes the bugbear of his captors. So he basically tries to stymie them or basically become as uncooperative as possible, and is beaten for his troubles over a prolonged period of time. He also gives up his rations to men he considers less fortunate than himself, and over a period of time he becomes malnourished through mistreatment, but also giving up his food to people who he thinks are actually more deserving than him. And there's a number of other witnesses to his bravery and in the face of the enemy, and men like Sir Anthony Farrar Hockley, who wrote the British Korean War official histories and was a prisoner of war himself after being captured on the Imjin River with the Gloucesters. He sees a lot of Slim's bravery, and it's partly some of his recommendations that get Slim awarded the George Cross after the Korean War. The Australian casualties, whilst we don't suffer the heaviest casualties of the war per capita as far as what we deploy, we do suffer quite significantly, even so soon after the end of the Second World War. So in total, the Australian deaths as a result of service in Korea is 340. 5 of these are suffered by the Royal Australian Navy, 294 by the Army, and the bulk of these are actually suffered during the so-called static war between 1952 and 53. And 41 airmen of the Royal Australian Air Force lose their lives as well. Wounded, there's 6 members of the Royal Australian Navy who are wounded, 1,210 Army, and an unknown figure of the RAF because they didn't keep accurate casualty statistics through the Korean War. And as I was saying before, 30 members of the Australian forces were taken prisoners as well. So that's there on the slide there to see. But that brings my presentation to an end, so I'll hand over to my friend and colleague Elise, who will take over and explain about some artefacts we have here.
So my name is Elise Horspool, and I'm an Assistant Curator in the Military Heraldry and Technology section of the Memorial. So our collection includes mainly objects, so anywhere from medals, badges, uniforms and souvenirs, up to aircraft, tanks, weaponry and munitions. So some of the roles that I do are researching and cataloguing our national collection on the collection management system. I interpret the national collection. I assess potential donations that you might send in. And I also participate in public programs such as this, as well as tours, families viewings, social media content and publications. For the last 2 months, Mick and I have actually been working on the Korean War 70 Years website hub. So that's been providing blog articles, online exhibitions and research resources. So as you can see, I have some items here from the National Collection, which were either purchased, worn, used or earned during the Korean War. So our Korean War collection is a little bit limited, purely because often the service personnel served in the Second World War and BCOF before, and then straight after they went to serve in Vietnam. So the objects that they used or collected during the Korean War were lost. But we did begin collecting some of our first Korean War objects in the late 1950s. So if you are wondering, I do have a personal connection to the Korean War, as well as professionally. So I was born in Seoul, near Gimpo Airport, and I guess you could say that I'm an anachronistic byproduct of the war in that I was adopted out of South Korea. Korean adoption actually came out of the Korean War, so since 1953, 200,000 Korean children have been adopted out of the country. It's also very likely that my biological relatives would have served or been affected by the Korean War. A lot of Korean families are still separated by the 38th parallel today. So this time last year, literally about 3 days ago last year, I was at Panmunjom, or it's also known as the Joint Security Area, JSA, which is actually the border between North and South Korea, where the Korean Armistice Agreement was signed on the 27th of July 1953. Now, I believe that the Korean War is a very undervalued conflict. As I mentioned before, it's unfortunately been sandwiched between two very large conflicts, Second World War and Vietnam. Millions of civilians were displaced or killed during this conflict, and the conflict is still ongoing today and has major ramifications on our region. So for the first object, I'd like to speak about this very colourful silk handkerchief, which is in very good condition. Silk handkerchiefs or handkerchiefs have had a very long tradition of being a wartime souvenir. We actually have some silk handkerchiefs from the Boer War to the First World War and the Second World War in our collection. The reason for this is because they're lightweight, they're inexpensive, they're economic, they're postable. You can just fold them up and shove them in a parcel, send them home, you can scrunch them up, they're washable. This one in particular, as you can see, it features the UN flags up the top of the countries, and then you've got a tank down the bottom, some aircraft, and then a tiger. Now, our silk handkerchief is quite unique in that I've yet to find another silk handkerchief from the era that features a tiger. For Korea, the Siberian tiger is the national animal of South Korea, and that's because Siberian tigers used to roam the Korean peninsula before they became extinct. They actually used the tiger as their mascot for the 1988 Seoul Olympics. As you can see on the slide, I've compiled some other silk handkerchiefs from the Korean War, and they predominantly feature a dragon. In Korean folklore, they tend to depict the dragon as serpent-like. He's known as Imugi, and that's because he's not yet fully fledged. On our handkerchief, you can see there's a city name here, which is Daegu or Daegu, which is it's the second largest city in South Korea, just north of Busan. Now, Busan is where the Australians arrived in September 1950, but prior to that, in August, after the outbreak of the war, the South Koreans, Americans fought against the North Koreans at Daegu in the Battle of Daegu, and they won. This was part of the Battle of the Busan Perimeter. As you can see at the top, there's a slogan, "Return from Hell." Now, it's unknown whether the Americans coined this or the South Koreans coined it and one or the other has adopted it, but this is extremely prolific in America in that a lot of American service personnel who served in Korea have adopted Return from Hell. It's on their unit patches and shields, it's on all their souvenir handkerchiefs, and sometimes on their uniforms. Now, these are very prolific in America, and I believe that this one in particular is probably collected from an American GI in Beekhoff in Japan. The reason these are prolific is that they were made in a cottage industry in either Seoul or Busan. It's screen printed or stenciled, and I think there are some elements of hand painting on here. Now, a cottage industry such as this is technically trench art, and they're objects that have been made in people's homes rather than mass-produced in factories. Korean civilians were severely impacted by this war due to the ongoing nature and the changing of the front. They were always displaced or homeless, and souvenirs or cottage industries were a great way that they could make money from the seemingly rich Americans or allied service personnel in their country. The second object I have here is a very iconic object that I'm sure most of you have seen before. This is an American issue pile cap that was worn by an Australian. This particular pile cap has synthetic fur on the ear flaps in the front, and it's made from cotton poplin. And on the front, it's been customised with a Rising Sun badge and an Australia Shoulder Title badge. This one was actually on display at some point, so the conservators have sewn the cotton tie here that would normally keep the ear flaps down and tied at the chin, tied up. And the reason for this is because the Australians were basically ordered not to wear their ear flaps down when in action because it caused hearing problems. Now, the pile cap here was worn by a man called Private Jeffrey Noel Wood, who served in 3 RAR. He only served a couple of months in 1951, but he did fight in the Battle of Kapyong on the 23rd and 24th of April 1951. Just put this back down. Now, pile caps, as I mentioned, are one of the most iconic uniform pieces worn by Australians in the Korean War. However, it's an American issue pile cap, so the Americans were wearing them. The North Koreans and Chinese also wore the pile caps, but they tended to favour fur or quilted pile caps. Unfortunately for the Australians, they weren't issued the warmer clothing and pile caps until very late in the piece, in late 1950 and early 1951. And the reason for this is that they weren't very well equipped, and it's freezing cold in Korea. If you've ever been there, easily gets below 0 degrees. I have been there when it's been minus 15 degrees. And the reason for this is because they have the Siberian winds coming from the north. When you think of Korea, you think of snow and ice, and you see those snow landscapes. It's very iconic of the Korean War. And the Australians who served in Korea had mainly come from serving in the Southwest Pacific regions, which is tropical. And also being from Australia, they really couldn't contemplate what a real winter was with snow. The Korean refugees who were displaced and homeless suffered terribly from exposure, and a lot of them died from exposure. And the Australian service personnel unfortunately suffered very badly from frostbite on their extremities. In the beginning, Australians had to supplement their own uniform issue with American issue. So there are stories of Australians raiding American stores for their winter issue, which included woolen long johns, waterproof pants, pile jackets similar to the synthetic fur here, and windproof coats. As you can see on the slide, I've included some imagery of the pile cap. So the first one is a portrait of Sergeant John Parker from the Royal Australian Air Force. It's a really lovely portrait by Ivor Heel, and he's wearing a pile cap which he has customised with the RAF Wings badge, and then right next to it is a photograph of that particular pile cap on display in our galleries. And then next to it you'll see 2 Australians helping an American POW. All 3 of them are wearing a variation of the pile cap, and then we've got some Australians in 3RR marching across some snowy fields in November 1950, all of them wearing pile caps, and you can actually see them, they've got the ear flaps down. And then the last photo is a very famous portrait of Sergeant Stafford Kenny Lenoy, who was unfortunately killed during the Battle of Kapyong, which Private Geoffrey Noel Wood fought in as well. That portrait was taken by Ian Robertson, who was actually the battalion's photographer and sniper. So as well as these the uniform item and the souvenir, I have 2 medal groups. Because medal groups can actually be a really great account of a person's service in multiple theatres and multiple wars. So this first group I have here, which is quite large, are the medals of Lieutenant William Owen Cello Roberts. Now, as you can see, he has 16 medals. However, that does not include the 2 unmounted medals, which are unofficial, which was the Tobruk and Battle for Malta medals from the Second World War. With medals, the highest award, so in his case the Distinguished Service Cross, is mounted first. And then it is followed by his Second World War campaign stars. And Australian medals are unique in that we impress all medals with the recipient's service number, rank, initials and surname on either the edge, so the bottom, or the reverse of the medal, depending on the medal or award. Lieutenant Roberts actually served in the Second World War on HMS Australia as a midshipman from September 1940 to September 1941. He then went on to become the executive officer of HMS Murchison, which is a frigate, and he served on that ship from the 11th of July 1950, so really early on in the piece, till the 27th of June 1952. Now, Roberts was on the Murchison when it was hit by a 75mm anti-tank round, a Chinese one, on the 30th of September 1951 when it was patrolling the Han estuary. The Murchison spent 60 days on the Han estuary, and it was patrolling but also bombarding North Korean and Chinese installations on the banks, and eventually they fought back. So in the photograph on the slide you can see Roberts there. He's pointing at the hole that round made in the engine room door. I think one sailor was injured during that incident, and then next to it is a photograph I've taken of a fragment of that round that is currently on display in the galleries. So Robert's commander, so the commander of the Murchison, was Lieutenant Commander Alan Nelson Dollard. He actually received a also Distinguished Service Cross for the action on the Hahn. Dollard was an interesting man. He was dubbed Baron Murchison of the Hahn, Lord Falk, and Viscount Spoon, due to the very eclectic names that the positions on the Hahn estuary were given. His commander was had a very long career. He actually served on the HMS Sydney when it outgunned the Bartolomeo Colleoni. He was on the HMS Australia during the Battle of the Coral Sea, and he was on the HMS Warramunga during the liberation of the Philippines. Now, Roberts, as you can see from his large medal group, he went on to become, after the Murchison, he ended up on the HMS Anzac, and he was the commander of that from 28th of June 1952 till 3rd of September 1953. So he actually served the whole war in Korea, which is quite unique. And he also went on to serve on HMS Sydney during the Vietnam War, so HMS Sydney 3. In 1965 on Operation Tanton, which was delivering 350 reinforcement personnel to one area. So our last medal group we have is the medals of Flight Lieutenant Edgar Wesley Guy. So from now on I'm just going to call him Wesley because he really didn't like Edgar. So Wesley's got a few. You probably recognise the Distinguished Flying Cross here, the British War Medal. He's got an oak leaf, and that oak leaf actually signifies a commendation for meritorious service in the air, the Australia Service Medal, the Korea Medal, the United Nations Medal for Korea, and then at the very end, he's got a foreign award, which is the United States Air Medal. It also has an oak leaf, which indicates he actually received a second award. On the slide, you can see Wesley. He's got a beautiful portrait oil painting done by Ivor Hill, and next to it is a photo of him at Kimpo Airport at a bar hanging out with his mates. He is second from the left. So Wesley served in number 77 Squadron, as Mick mentioned in the history. He was flying a Gloster Meteor. We actually have the nose section of a Gloster Meteor on display in our Korean War galleries. Her name is Rosemary. And then we also have the fuselage section of a MiG-15 in the aircraft hall, which unfortunately we were outclassed against and we lost. So Wesley served in Korea from 10th of February 1952 to the 14th of September 1952. He was born on Samurai Island in Milne Bay in Papua in 1922, and during the Second World War he was mostly training, but he did at the end of the war end up serving with number 33 Squadron flying to quotas, and his role was to repatriate Australian service personnel from the Southwest Pacific area, so mainly Lae, but he also helped repatriate POWs of the Japanese. In Korea, Guy flew 178 operational sorties, of which 80 were direct strike attacks against enemy troops or supply lines. Now, the terrain, if you've ever been to Korea, is very mountainous, it's very treacherous, there's very poor visibility. But funnily, the country's, it's known as the land of the morning calm. 33 Australians were killed in flying battles or accidents during the war. And Guy actually became a flight commander, so he led a lot of these attacks, and he received the US Air Medal for his time in Korea. So he got the Distinguished Flying Cross in Korea for leading a rocket attack against the North Koreans in very poor visibility on the 27th of August 1952, but he was able to completely destroy that installation. After the war, Guy actually moved back to PNG, where he worked as an instructor for Douglas Airways, but he actually started his own airline called Wes Guy Aviation Services in the 1970s. So I hope you found these objects interesting. The majority of our Korean War collection is actually on display in the galleries, so you'll have to come and visit and have a look at it there. If you'd like to learn more, as I mentioned, Mick and I have been working on the Korean War 70 Years Hub on our website, so you can always utilise the resources on there. But if you want to learn more about some objects or stories from the Korean War, we've been posting quite a lot on our Facebook, Instagram and Twitter accounts. Thank you.
Thank you to our presenters for today, Michael and Elise. We've had a couple of questions come in through our Q&A, so I'll ask those of our presenters now. If you've got a question to ask, you've got a couple of minutes to send those through to us, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. First up, we've got a question from Denise, or Denny's, I'm not quite sure on the pronunciation of that, which is, how prepared were our soldiers for the type of war they encountered in Korea? What impact did the lessons learned have on training subsequent to the war? So we'll hear about that from our panellists now.
Oops, sorry. The Australians weren't really prepared for the war that they faced in Korea. Second World War veterans surely were, because they'd seen combat in tropical places such as in the Southwest Pacific, fighting the Japanese. So when they were faced with Korean summers, they were used to the heat in the tropics, but the Korean winters were something new again. So the initial winter of 1950-51, the Australians were not prepared for that at all. So having to fight a war against a very highly mobile and well-kitted army was something that they had to overcome on the fly. So initially with British winter kit, and then finally later on with, as they could get it, the American winter kit, which was far superior as well. So lessons learned, they certainly were adapting and improving as the war went on. So the Australians had a battle school in Japan at Haramura, and so they were able to conduct warfighting exercises and basically conduct lessons learned sort of training at that battle school for all future recruits and units as they were getting prepared to go into Korea, and even some refresher training for guys who'd already been there as well. So it's they certainly learnt on the fly and were able to adapt and put those lessons in.
Thank you. So we've got another question from Tony. And firstly, Tony said, great presentation. There was mention that the war was overshadowed and veterans are only recently getting the recognition they deserve. Are there other reasons why you think the war was sort of overlooked, e.g. political or societal? How was the war viewed during and after by politicians and the public?
I guess I think Korea's in a bit of a hard place that, yes, Second World War had just happened, and then Vietnam, which also doesn't really get the attention it deserves either, happened straight after. And also Korea at the time was not a very well-known country. People who were serving over there probably didn't even know where Korea was themselves, let alone the people back in Australia who were going, oh, why are we in Korea? Where's Korea? I've never heard of this place. Which is interesting because Korea is such an economic powerhouse, has very strong soft power with Korean culture, and everyone knows where Korea is now. So it's a big contrast. As to why it wasn't acknowledged as much, yeah, it can be quite hard to understand that. Mick might be able to elaborate more.
Yeah, it certainly was. Even during the war, the mobile phase of the war was really highly publicised and well reported on back in Australia. But once the war became more static, the interest in Korea sort of waned as media outlets didn't send journalists up there, and veterans themselves even started calling themselves forgotten, even in 1952, with less coverage back home. As Elise was saying before, with the drawdown of forces post the Second World War, there was a great war weariness in Australia. So the fighting in Korea was largely overlooked, and even the Second World War veterans who didn't go to Korea were fairly apathetic towards what was going on, and gave some of the veterans quite a hard time when they came home as well, which is quite unfortunate. So there was a fair bit of bitterness at the time with Korean veterans, sort of knowing that what they were doing up there was really not appreciated by what was going on, other than friends and family and loved ones at home, and also their mates. But it wasn't seen as a very popular war, or certainly something not worthy of recognition at home as well.
Thank you. We've got another question from Callum, who says, I would be interested to hear about Australian soldiers working with other UN forces. Was this common? How did other nations view Australia's involvement and contribution?
This is a really interesting time for Australians being involved with other forces in the United Nations. So you've got Australians serving with or being posted into British units. There's a number of Australians actually in command of, not of whole units, but in command of companies or sections in armoured units that their comrades actually came into contact with whilst they were serving alongside the New Zealand forces, and also being posted into the United States forces as well as liaison officers, and you see that in particular during the Static War. There's even cases of men like Lieutenant Gus Breen, who is being with American forward observer forces for artillery spotting. So he's serving with the 1st Battalion, but is assigned as a forward air controller or a spotter for artillery. So there's a number of Australians who get to serve in wider United Nations formations throughout the Korean conflict. And this has maintained, been maintained even to current day, looking at how many Australians are posted into allied staff colleges or units to gain experience and gain better understanding of how each nation operates in that coalition sort of warfare. So it's a fascinating time. This is a real time where this is not just implemented but also strengthened, and we can see that result being continued today. So it's a fascinating time.
Garth has asked for each of our presenters to let us know which are their favourite objects from the Memorials collection from the Korean War. So we might start with Elise and hear about her favourite object.
It's a bit hard to pick, to be honest. Most of them are actually on display in the Korean War galleries. As for an object, I'm just thinking there's actually a medal on display that a lot of people walk past because it's in the first cabinet on the right, which is the beginning of the war. And it's actually the Order of the Taegukgi, which is the highest military award that South Korea has. And we actually have one that was given to Korea as a country to say thank you for their contribution to the war. So that's probably my favourite object.
For me, it's a lot more simple. For having done a lot of work with 2RAR's Battle of the Samichon, and actually spending a fair bit of time with Brian, either in person over at his place in Western Australia and on the phone. His flak vest is on display in the Korean War galleries, and it's the one he wore during the Battle of the Samichon when he actually called artillery down onto his own positions to stop them being overrun by Chinese who had broken into the US Marine positions adjacent. So if I had to pick a favourite object as a symbol of survival and overcoming the odds, I think that one speaks volumes.
So Daniel has sent through 2 questions. First up, who created the 38th parallel, which I think is, obviously it's a central part of Korea even today, and that Korea is so, but often we don't know about the origins of that. So if you can tell us a bit more. And he's also asked for some information about your book, Mike, if you can, Mick, if you can share some of that information as well.
Idea. The 38th parallel, I think it was Dean Rusk, who became a US politician, was a lieutenant in the US Army at the time, and it was his task, and along with one of his comrades, to as the Russians were advancing down, they actually suggested to the Russians that the 38th parallel would be a natural border. And to their great surprise, the Russians agreed, because the Rusk was expecting the Russians to say, no, we want it further back down. But 38th parallel was agreed on by both sides at the idea or the suggestion of the Americans. With the Korean War book, In From the Cold, this was, we cover basically the early pre-Korean knowledge of what the West actually did know on Korea. What the Australians knew as well. So there's some great papers or chapters in there, by Professor Alan Millett and the greatest living Australian historian, Professor Robert O'Neill. They cover some really interesting aspects here. We've got Dick Hallion, who's a US Air Force historian covering the air war, Jack McCaffrey with the Royal Australian Navy and Fleet Air Arm operations. And there's some great chapters as well. Rebecca Fleming, who presented on the nurses' role in the Korean War, which is another overlooked part of Korea as well. So the book is wide-ranging, and it provides a really great primer for knowledge on Korea. So it's, personally speaking, I know I'm quite biased. It's highly recommended reading, and is available through the Memorial Shop, as I was saying before, the A News website, and also free to read on the A News website as well. So it's a great resource and easily accessible. So I hope you get to read it.
We've got a question from Emily, who's asked, what objects from the Korean War would we most like to acquire into the memorials collection? Is there anything major that is missing? And Elise alluded to that a little bit earlier in her presentation, so I might ask her to answer that one.
As I mentioned, we do have a lot of Korean War objects in the collection, but quite a lot of them, I'd say a majority of them, are on display. The thing that I mentioned was that it's limited in that we have quite a lot of metal groups. We have quite a lot of uniform pieces, but what we really lack is objects like this, so souvenirs that were collected during the war, and that's a little bit difficult because in the first couple of years the war moved around a lot, so I don't think that the Australians would have had a lot of time to collect these souvenirs. But another couple of objects that we would really be interested in would be objects that have personal significance. So whether they're trinkets or objects they've picked up or they've been gifted or were used during service in Korea would be really, really interesting to get our hands on, because Korean War service records are really difficult to access, so we kind of fill in the gaps as best we can through research, but it doesn't provide those personal stories we're really looking for.
So I think this might be our last question, and we've had one that has asked about Aboriginal Australian involvement during the Korean War. Can you give us some information about that, please, Nick?
We're still finding out the exact numbers of Indigenous Australians who served in Korea, but we do know of some quite famous examples, like Stephen Dodd, who was an actor, a future actor. Obviously, Lanoy, as Stafford Lenny Lanoy, as Elise spoke about before, who was killed during the Battle of Kapyong. And there are a number of others, but we have our Indigenous liaison section led by Mr. Michael Bell, who it's their constant job to look at identifying Indigenous servicemen, and I don't know the exact figure for Korea that have been identified yet, but it's a significant amount of Indigenous service personnel who actually see action in the Korean War, and it's an ongoing project to identify them and bring their stories to light. And it's really exciting to be part of that project as a historian and being able to research and contribute to that project.
Thank you. So we'll squeeze in one more because it's come through, and it's an interesting one. So Lito has asked, I'd like to know what the impact of the Korean War is on international relations and foreign policies today. Is it visible in our present setting?
I think you can certainly say yes. The Korean War has an enduring impact on our region and the globe. You're looking at the Australian foreign policy and also defence policies are dramatically affected by what is happening today, currently in North Korea, and also with the Chinese expansion into the sea lanes as well with the islands. So we do have a number of our foreign policy especially, and the regional foreign policy towards Korea, and North Korea in particular, and China are very much sort of a dominant in our region. But Australia is also a signatory to the Washington Agreement, which is signed the day after the armistice, which means that if the Republic of Korea is again threatened or attacked, we are obliged to come to the aid of the Republic of Korea as well. So it's one of those things that certainly is an ongoing interest, and is certainly focused on by our diplomats and military as well.
Well, thank you. So that brings our Museum at Home webinar on the Korean War to a close. Thank you for all of your questions, and a big thanks to our two presenters today, Mick and Elise. We hope that you enjoyed the presentation. If you don't already follow us on social media, please search the Australian War Memorial on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, and YouTube, where you'll also be able to find the video of this webinar and see more of our content. Thank you and bye.